I take it that's my cue.
In just a moment. Okay. So we want to say greetings and welcome to today's educational program, Managing for Quality Lecture Series number 4, Strategy, Inquiry, Formulation, and Deployment by Dr. Gregory H. Watson. This is your moderator, Doug Wood, with ASQ's Quality Management Division. We have the distinct pleasure of hearing from Dr. Watson today. We want to welcome him. Dr. Watson's bio covers a lot of ground. He has degrees in management, law, and industrial engineering. He's an 18-year ASQ Fellow and past Chair of the year 2000. That's Chair of ASQ. He received the ASQ Distinguished Service Medal, plus the Lancaster Medal, Crosby, and Ishikawa Medals. He's been named an honorary member by 17 national quality associations. Dr. Watson delivered speeches to 20 or more ASQ national and regional conferences, twice for the Quality Management Division. As a former quality executive with Hewlett-Packard and Compaq Computer and Xerox, he's coached executives in quality transformations at Nokia Mobile Phones and Toshiba and ExxonMobil and over 20 other companies. He's the only Westerner to be awarded a Deming Medal by the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers, the W. Edwards Deming Medal Award for Dissemination and Promotion overseas in 2009. So without any more, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Watson. Greg, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doug. So this evening, we're going to discuss this concept of how executives conduct inquiry into establishing quality management and formulating strategy. And we're going to have, this will be covering just a couple of parts. So the first part, we're going to focus on management's strategic job, and that is to find the future and facilitate the journey towards achievement of its objectives. This is one of the ideas that is important in modern strategy as we are moving to quality as a distinctive ingredient of success for organizations. No longer is it just a business fundamental, it's becoming a distinctive ingredient that sets businesses apart. And that's becoming more and more important as we start thinking about what the future will hold actually after all this uncertainty we have from the coronavirus and the impact of economic shutdowns around the world. If we start thinking about this idea of deploying a strategic vision in an organization, it really requires consensus. Think what happens when the 6 blind men try to describe an elephant. I know you've seen this all before. One says it's a spear, another says it's a fan, a wall, a snake, a tree, a rope. They can't gain a common perspective that permits them to have a shared vision of reality. In order to have a good consensus-based approach to strategy where everyone is linked and aligned and moving in the same direction, it requires that we gain a common vision and a shared view of where we're going to go so we can create a mutual support for how that organization will move forward. This webinar and the next webinar are going to be synchronized. They will describe how strategic quality operates as a management system, present the general theory of planning strategic improvement projects for any enterprise-wide business system, and provide insight into a systems of systems approach to quality planning applied in major Japanese businesses. This one will focus on the general theory at the front end of the process. The next one will go into detail of the whole Japanese management system, or the Kanri of Kanris. It's sometimes described as Hoshin Kanri, but it's much more rich than that term implies. And so we will cover that in a more full detail next time. Strategic quality is a relatively new concept. The idea of strategic quality was actually initiated by Joseph Juran and developed by quality professionals at JUICE. In 1964, Juran introduced the concept of quality as policy, and he differentiated breakthrough from incremental improvement. He did this in his 1964 book, Managerial Breakthrough, and a series of lectures he delivered in Japan. He also came up with his idea of big Q versus little q thinking in his book, Quality Planning and Analysis in 1980, where he described a quality way of implementing organization-wide strategy planning. The Japanese took these ideas and from it, starting in the 1960s, developed a system of Kanri, which we know as Hoshin Kanri in the West. In 1991, Yoji Akao, an honorary member of ASQ, published the edited version of a Japanese study that he prepared for the Japanese Standards Association for Hoshin Kanri. And we got to see the whole history of that development at that place and time. In 2003, the Japanese Society for Quality Control established national standards for Hoshin Kanri and daily management. And those first two editions were then updated in 2013, and they're scheduled to be updated again in 2023. In the last session, we talked about managing business as a system, and we described how there are different levels of organization activities that happen, the enterprise level, the business level, and the operations level. And we see that each of these has a different role. And what we're going to do is we will focus on the enterprise and the business levels as we're talking here. The operations level is about the daily management system, which will be a topic that we cover in a subsequent webinar. Now we start thinking about this top level of the organization, and this is what Dr. Duran referred to as Big Q. And Big Q, or Big Quality, is about the strategic quality management system of an organization. It's defined by all of the items here in black bullets. This is the Big Q process of managing for quality. The red items are the strategic content. This is what is the deliverable out of the strategic quality planning process. And collectively, these items all combine to be called strategic quality. The way we go about delivering such a system in the organization is by creating a change management system. So what strategic quality is doing is it's introducing change into the system for daily management. So strategic quality is changing daily management. And now what we see here in the black is all of the items in the daily management system. And this is where we see the work being done in the organization. In the last lecture, I called Gemba 1 this daily management system, the routine work that's being done in an organization. And the higher levels of management, Gemba 2 and Gemba 3, are the business leadership systems. And that's the responsibility of the leadership system. And we see that there is a strategic dialogue occurring between these two, so we can figure out how do we apply resources in the organization to make the value production in the daily management system more effective, efficient, and economical. Now, there are in this organization across these three levers a number of factors that help to link and align. And these systems that are if you will, levers of change that management can move to create the alignment and get everybody moving in the same direction so that they can achieve this consensus on the direction they're going and the activities that they have to improve the work that's done in the daily business today so that it can be stronger in the future. First is shared vision of the strategic direction, that everyone is seeing things in the same way and they're moving in the same direction. Shared also needs to be the collective core culture and operating philosophy, so people have the same mindset about how they're thinking and the same philosophy about how they're working. There should be a standardized risk management system, so people view risk in the same way and accept or avoid risk in the collective way that is reinforcing of the organization. There needs to be an integrated performance management system so that we can see how ideas will move into the organization, how feedback goes back to management, so that we can understand what's happening across those three levels of that business operation. There also needs to be some sort of unified objectives deployment process. So as we're having change introduced into the organization, we can move that change in a consistent way across all the levels and across all of different types of organizations and functions that we see. Therefore, there also needs to be a common approach to process management to accept that change into the daily management system. And finally, there needs to be a consistent approach to continual improvement so we can integrate all of that work together. We will see that these are the items that we will talk about in the system of systems for a strategic planning process. Now, when we think about this at the beginning, we said that you begin with the vision. And the vision deployment, or driving the strategic intent of an organization, is what we focus on at this top level. This is the job of the executive function. So strategic plans deploy the vision of the organization into actions so that the strategic intent, or what management wants to achieve in the future, is able to exist in a future state. So visionary leadership is doing some things. It finds a competitive niche. It formulates plans to achieve that niche. It facilitates the actions to achieve that result, and it finds a pathway to obtain future results. So finding the future is the job of Gemba 3. It's a governance function in the organization. This is where we set the organization's purpose, vision, strategic intent, and we obtain the resources to support the deployment of that strategy. Formulation of the plan is a job of Gemba 2, the second tier in our 3 levels of management. And in Gemba 2, we develop the strategy into projects that can be completed to achieve the change and value. Facilitating the journey says we not only do the plan, but we implement that plan, and we effectively monitor it to achieve an economic benefit and a productive benefit for the organization. And finally, we see the job of funding that pathway. So the job of Gemba 3 is to provide the strategic resources, while the job of Gemba 2 is to deploy these resources. This last week, I received an email from one of the listeners in the last session that said, can you please tell me more about these Gemba 1, 2, and 3 and how they operate? This will actually be embedded in all 12 of these lectures as we move along, and they will be more clear as we go through the process. We've shared this visual before where we talk about how we actually manage problems from a system perspective. Gemba 1, the workplace, is a function where we have improvement through continual improvement projects. Gemba 2 is where we have breakthrough, and Gemba 3 is where we do transformation of the entire organization. When we look at the collection of all of those together, that's when we see continuous improvement happen. So collective activity across this whole organization is really what we're doing. It's the process of managing change. So first, we have to identify the problem domain. Second, discover its solution space. And then third, formulate a project aimed at delivering that solution. Now, I like to think of this front end as kind of the Spider-Man situation. So we have to have an observation. If we think about Spider-Man as a cartoon character, what we see is that when he is hanging out on the side of a building, he has a little tingling sensation in the back of his head that we call the Spidey sense. And it gives him a heightened awareness that there's something unusual out there. In other words, he's received a situational signal that says something's happened. He hears it, but other people don't. He recognizes that there is some meaning, but he hasn't been able to make sense out of it yet. But once he detects that change in the situation, he now knows that he has to focus and figure out, how do I drill down into that feeling and understand the sensation that says there's an issue that needs to be resolved? Well, the same happens in organizations. When we are first approached by something, it may not actually be very well formulated. It may be this issue. One way of dealing with this is what's been called the OODA Loop. And this is a way to challenge our inquiry process. It provides an opportunity for results. And what we see on this vertical stack of process blocks is we see there is some phenomena in the situation. And we have to go into some situational monitor first. We have to notice it. We have to observe it. So that's the observe part of the OODA Loop. Then we have to make sense out of it. We have to perceive it, bring it into our brains, and then record it. And once we've done that, we have data. When we've got the data, we can go into the orientation loop. So the beginning part is all about the plan. The orientation loop is do and act. It's analyze and interpret. And that tells us what to do about something. We move into decide and act, to judge and execute. And what we see embedded here is a number of things. We see the OODA Loop. We also see situational awareness, sense-making. We see different feedback cycles. And we see that this is one way for us to execute improvement actions. This was created by Colonel John T. Boyd, who was an Air Force colonel. And he used this as a way of training fighter pilots on how to react in a combat situation. That first you have to observe the situation, orient where is that gap between where you are, what you want to be, decide what you do, and act very quickly. And the idea is this needs to be done very rapidly in organizations. Well, this concept allows us to see something that's embedded into the strategic planning process of many organizations. As we start seeing, this left-hand column is actually what we're now digitizing in many organizations, that we have digital sensors moving this into data. And in the virtual ASQ conference that's going to be held next week, I'm giving a lecture on this in Monday afternoon. But what we want to do is talk a little bit about this concept of situational awareness. This is where we're sensing the issues. And what's happening is we have to have a constant scan of our environment to discover, are there some unusual circumstances? So what happens in that environmental scan? Well, first, we're differentiating between noise and some sort of signal that's perhaps a little weak in this ebb and flow of the noise in our environment. So there's a number of things that happen. First, we have to monitor the world of facts. We look at the events beyond just the realm of chance. What are the facts we have? And so the world of facts, we're coming in the top level of our three-tiered organization. So this is in the executive realm. And then we have to balance that against the world of possibilities. And at that first tier of the organization, we might do something like the scenario planning, options analysis, and we start trying to understand what are the different ways that the facts and the possibilities can blend together. And once we understand that, then we have to assess all of those scenarios against our critical assumptions and find out, are there weaknesses or vulnerabilities in our business model? And we have to discover, are there discontinuities or disruptions, and discern what events will have the potential to create opportunities or catastrophes in a situation. So strategy specifies a path to achieve the vision. Strategic managements occur in the Bayesian moment. And I've mentioned the Bayesian moment before. So what we see in the Bayesian moment, as a reminder, is we see hindsight where we're looking at history. Maybe we have control charts about data. And then what we see is this is a fact-driven, sense-making activity. We also see that we would like to create foresight. Foresight is what will happen in the future. This is the realm of science. Science is about prediction based on knowledge of facts. And if we know prediction well enough, we can generalize laws of nature. And then that's a customer-oriented. It's about predictive analytics. What do we need to deliver out of our process? Inside the process, we have insight. So insight is how we think about the situation. It's the realm of psychology. And this is where we have the situational awareness happening. This has to be team facilitated so we can get everyone's ideas moving together. And finally, we see that the Bayesian moment is the center place where we start seeing hindsight being converted using insight to create foresight. And at that critical juncture, we decide today how we will manage for tomorrow. So that is where we see the strategic planning process, the daily management systems, and the operations of organizations actually coming to bear, and what we're seeing in the daily work of the organization. Now, Sensemaking has external sources as well. Sensemaking seeks to understand what are the discontinuities or disruptions from the desired state that we would like to have. And this external scan is requiring us to look at a full range of different ideas. So we look at the economy, financial markets, sources of financing. We look at the technology advances in products or process equipment. We look at the environment and the surroundings and the impact it has on us. We try to understand the movements of the competition and the decisions that they make, the impact of politics and philosophy and principles that are shifting in our society, as well as how the impact of laws or regulations will affect our operations. We also see we have to look internally. So we have an external view and we have an internal view. So internally, we're trying to understand what are the discontinuities or disruptions from the desired events that are happening from the inside of the organization. So in addition to the external scan, we take an internal scan. And here we take a look at what is the quality of the resources we have. How strong is our supply chain? How strong is our working capital? How strong is the competence of our people? We have to develop the skills and competence of our people so that the human resources will meet the future and business and technical challenges of the organization. The technology capability of our productive systems also has to be evaluated. And here we see we have to evolve our core technology so it will be able to deliver strength in our productive system in the future. The effectiveness of our business control systems is also important, particularly since we start seeing that there's risk implicit in the many things that we do in operating our business. So what constraints are in our business today? So we see there's a system of constraints operating. We have technological or physical constraints, process or human-based constraints, standards, legal or regulatory constraints. Many of these are out of the control of workers, and these have to be managed separately outside of the daily management system so that we remove the barriers that inhibit the flow of the work and the productive work that's happening at the front line in the organization. So when we're trying to understand any issue, something that's happening, the spidey sense has been activated. First, we have to identify what's the issue, what's out of control. Can we understand, what is it that we're sensing? Where are we judging this performance from? What are the indicators we have? And then we have to evaluate the elements that are involved in this. Who is it affecting? What is the outcome? What will happen if we don't fix this? Where is it taking place? What needs to be fixed? Is there a sense of urgency that we have in terms of the timing of the fix? And then why is it important for this to be fixed rather than something else, the priority? And then we have to define that issue as a problem statement. In other words, what will we be doing in the future as we move forward to correct that action? And so we have to think about what will that action improvement really consist of. Now, one way to do this is to go through a little 7-step process. Many issues happen in organizations. And the question is, do we actually set up the right priorities? So we can go through an issue analysis process. So the problem is a gap between the current state and desired state. And what we have to do is understand, well, what's happening in our standard work practices? What changed? When did it change? So what else changed at that time? What were the reasons behind the change? What were the effects on customers, productivity, and cost? So first, we identify the issue, we select it, identify the customer and what the customer wants, describe the goal that we're meant to achieve, measure our results, and then we see what's the gap between the two? What's the capability that we should have in the process? And then we're able to define the problem. One way of taking a look at that problem definition is using this approach called the 5W2H. And this is a problem narrative approach where we're just trying to understand how do we describe the issue. So as we start going from a relatively uninformed spidey sense and trying to put it into words before we create an action statement, one thing we may do is go through these 5 questions, actually 7 questions. So what happened? Who was there? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? How did it happen? And how much happened? Now, interestingly enough, this is exactly the problem narrative that's is used by the senior management teams in the Toyota management system. They don't have a very fancy way of trying to understand all the conditions. They're not doing a lot of mathematical analysis, but they're trying to understand how do we organize our collective thinking and try to formulate a clear view of what the problem, issue, or concern is that's facing our organization. Once we have that issue, we can evolve it into a problem statement. So problem statements need to be based on a performance measure. A quantitative way that we've agreed is going to be describing exactly the situation. And if we measure using that, we say we can move this performance indicator, and if we move it in this direction and this magnitude, we've created a successful outcome. The second thing that goes into problem statement is desired direction of change. And that says the trend needs to increase, decrease, or reduce, or control. So this is the desired level of direction, or desired direction we'd like the change to go. So for instance, if we need to increase something, for instance, productivity, revenues, profit share, those are all factors where the performance, the problem state would say increase productivity. If we want to control something, we might want to say we would like to control on-time delivery. If we want to reduce something, we might say we want to reduce cycle time or defects. And we can identify the desired level of change as a process capability. And so as we're looking at this, we can understand each of those first two components, but then we have to specify something about location that tells us the scope. Where? What's a realistic time period for performance improvement? Where in the process should we focus on this in terms of location? So a problem statement does not, though, set the desired targets. It doesn't say do it by how much or set an expectation for a solution. It doesn't say we're going to perform by 5% by implementing something. That is the whole solution statement. So that happens after we've matured and completed an investigation. So the problem statement is initiating our inquiry process. Now, Phil Crosby said, problems breed problems, and the lack of a disciplined method of openly attacking them breeds even more problems. So this proper definition is important. And we can use some ways of thinking about this and say, is something occurring by chance, or is it actually occurring in a way that we can see there is some pattern? So we can express this using a chi-squared statistic. And what we see is that higher order problems breed lower order problems. And we can't resolve the lower order problems if the higher order problems are not corrected first. So the chi-squared method is where we take a look and we say we're going to develop a test for criticality. We see our observed data and we divide it by our estimated data. So if we say that we are going to do something in 2 months and we do it in 6 months, we see that the actual is 3 times greater than the estimated. Now, what that means is that we are 3 times worse. So the larger this chi-squared ratio, the more unexpected the event is. If it's approaching 1, we're doing exactly what we had planned. So we can use this type of statistic to formulate management-directed projects and improve criticality based on the issue that we have to address. So this is one statistical way we can use to check and say, are we actually doing the right priority problems in terms of the things that are most important in terms of making change. Now, in the second part, we'd like to address a different issue. And this is, what is strategic management? It's a disciplined approach for solving future problems. So strategic quality planning was translated as Hoshin Kanri in Japanese. It was originally translated into English as policy deployment. But this word policy doesn't conform to the Western meaning of policy. It was first introduced by Duran in 1964 in his lectures, and the senior Japanese management said this was a breath of fresh air, because until that point in time, all they had been hearing about was statistics, 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 and they hadn't really understood what the concept of management was. And Duran introduced the idea of managerial breakthrough. But because there was no word in Japan, they used an ancient term, the term Hoshin Kanri. Now, if we look at this term Hoshin Kanri, it has a very clear etymology. The first part, ho, is a character that means method or form. It's the discipline of soldiering. The name is used to describe the second position in kendo, fighting with a samurai sword with the katana. And what it means is you're ready to engage and you're fully anticipating the moves of your opponent. So you know how the opponent will strike, how they will counter your blows or try to. You know how to win and how to deliver the killing blow at the end. And that's all in that first word. The second word, shin, is the illuminated compass needle that allows you to see true north on the darkest night. That's the phosphorus that's pointing on the magnetic end of the compass, so on the needle of the compass. Kanri is a system of management. And what we see is that this Hoshin Kanri is actually the application of plan, do, check, act logic to management. This concept was first developed in the late 1960s, between 1964 and 1967, whereas plan, do, check, act was first developed in Japan in 1959. So we start seeing there's an evolutionary process of thinking, and these ideas are actually very tightly linked to each other. So what is Hoshin Kanri? Well, it's a management system for setting strategic direction and guiding change across an organization's functions. Dr. Ishikawa said, top managers and middle managers must be bold enough to delegate as much authority as possible. And that means making decision rights or delegating decision rights to the front line of the organization as much as they possibly can. He says that is a way to establish respect for humanity as your management philosophy. The management system which all employees participate from top down and from bottom up, and humanity is fully respected. That is Hoshin Kanri strategic direction setting, combined with systematic improvement project execution. And that's what we're going to see as the elements of Hoshin Kanri that we see in the process. Now, in Japan, everything begins with developing the work standards. And so strategic change applies the standardized do-check-act cycle before it engages plan do-check-act. Here we see 3 cycles of learning. And the first one, we're understanding the situation. That's where we're defining the issue in the problem statement. In the second, we're documenting that problem statement. In the third loop, we're simplifying it, getting rid of waste and loss. And then we're up to a level of capability where standard work has been developed. And now we can start executing projects that change the system, not just put it into a state of control. So what's important, though, is understanding what is strategic about the check step. In the check step, we're asking 2 questions. Do we have control? And do we have sufficient resources to make the change happen? So check is a pivot point, if you will, between standardization, kaizen, and the process of change management, or Hoshin. What happens in that check step? Well, there's a number of things going on. So there are 5 we can identify. So first, we evaluate performance against standards, historical records, and targets. Say, what's the gap? Second, we have reflection. So we start looking at what are the reasons, what can we learn about the reasons for gaps existing. We also conduct problem solving to close those gaps based on the analysis of causes that we can come out of that system. We'll do experiments and conduct them to define performance boundaries and figure out how can we move improvement further. And we make decisions about how to start improvement projects to apply new resources. So the check step is actually where we define change projects. Now, Japan, in their Japanese standards for daily management, shows a graph like this. And they're asking the question, do we have control? Do we have resources? If we have control and we have resources, then it's a kaizen project. It can be done in the standardized do-check-act loop. If the answers are no, then we have to move into the PDA cycle for change management. And that's going to move us into a Hoshin project. In Gemba 1, the workplace structure, we see there are 2 jobs, do work and improve work. So the check activity is actually a shared event. It's the pivot point between standardized do-check-act and planned do-check-act. And we see check activities are objectively reviewing the current state to determine what is the situation, that's the situational awareness, and how do we make sense out of it in order to achieve what's happening. So all of this is going on in that Bayesian moment of the organization. Now, coming out of that process, we're choosing what do we do. And so we're actually making a choice about the concerns, the issues we have. We've created them into problems. And we're trying to say, what do we do in this Bayesian moment to develop a consensus plan that will move the organization forward? So we ask ourselves a question. What is the current state? Is it a known root cause or unknown root cause? And if it's a known solution, we don't worry about it. If it's an unknown solution, is it a kaizen event because we know the root cause? That's about operational process change, or is it a strategic change because we don't know the root cause, we don't know the solution, and therefore it's going to be a Hoshin project. So the projects that come out of strategic planning process can be either kaizen projects or Hoshin projects. Now in part 3, what we start seeing is that executive strategic intent to improve is driving the formulation of these strategic projects. So we visualize a management planning cycle. And so this is a transformative process of strategic management. It begins with the executive function doing a strategy assessment. Where are we now? What do we know about the past? Then they go into a search. What can we do in terms of opportunities in the future to address the vulnerabilities?
And then we formulate the strategy. What it will be the projects that we deploy into the organization to change the work and improve our direction. We implement those strategies by deploying them as a strategic change project, and then we move that into daily management. When the project's complete, we stabilize the process, and then we have a strategy monitor that completes the feedback loop. So this is the general concept of strategic planning. Now we can see this in more detail in this graphic. So here we see there's a line drawn in the middle. We see Gemba 1, the operational function, Gemba 2, the executive function. And we see there's a number of feedback loops. So the whole loop is called the strategy management loop. We see there's a strategy target setting loop as we come from strategy formulation and target setting that we're going to be monitoring. We have an operating control loop going here. Work management is happening, so SDCA is happening in the daily management system. And we also have a top management feedback loop here, where we have management review of the current capabilities. So this whole cycle is going to be what we're seeing in terms of driving strategic change in an organization. And we're talking about conducting inquiry. We're talking about the three processes at the top: strategy assessment, strategy search, and strategy formulation. So what is process of strategy assessment? So here what we're seeing is this is where we bring in third parties for audits and reviews. It can be an accounting firm or a consulting firm. We do benchmarking of external organizations, and we conduct external, self-assessments by the executive team. And this could be the Malcolm Baldrige Award or performance to plan analysis of prior changes that we have in terms of how well did we actually do in implementing strategic change. So this is an executive-directed inquiry process that evaluates what were the effects of implementing our prior strategies and learning how do we adjust our approach to achieve our vision and achieve the long-term purpose of any enterprise. The strategic search is trying to figure out how do we create transitions, and we're collecting then challenging issues, and we're trying to filter them into opportunities for improvement that will reduce inherent vulnerabilities in the business system and create a prioritized portfolio of strategic change projects. So we want to see here the risk and cost benefits of opportunities for improvement. Evaluate organization resources to determine what will be required to formulate an improvement process and to address a change that's being presented. And then we're going to sequence those potential improvement projects according to priority for making the change. Hiroshi Osada in 1998, in an article in the Strategic Change Journal, described what he called SMBP, or Strategic Management by Policy. And what's interesting about this is he talked about this process of policy formulation. He says it's unclear, even in Japan. That is the vulnerable linkage. How do we actually formulate the change that we need to do? And so he was talking about then, this is all activities that precede, if you will, the management by policy or policy deployment system. This is about the fuzzy front end of strategic planning, because we have the guiding principles, the vision, and this drives business planning strategy and corporate planning strategies. And then we formulate the plan of action that implements management policy. And so there's a number of tools. This is all top-down, whereas TQM and other quality systems are more bottom-up. So there's a number of tools that are going to be addressed in this process. Now, the word policy is very different in Japanese. Here in the West, we tend to think of policy as being sort of a round concept. In other words, it's very soft. We have a human resources policy. We have a policy for how we're going to have non-prejudicial systems in how we manage daily work. We will have a policy, for instance, about how we apply benefits and compensation to different levels of jobs and positions. But in Japan, it's very specific. It's a system for aligning people to do work, making sense out of how we engage the employees to participate. We engage the whole organization, and we identify it in terms of measurable indicators of quality, cost, time, and breakthrough projects. Targets are set for the enterprise, not for a single person. and they're analyzed for the whole system. They're not set arbitrarily. And then management has to engage the workers, and then management should be imbued in the process. So the Japanese term of policy is better translated using strategy. And so this is the policy deployment process that we see in organizations. So if we take a look, this is what is deployed. So what most people think of or describe in many of the literature in the West as Hoshin Kanri is actually what the Japanese call Hoshin tenkai, and it's what they call policy deployment. Tenkai is a word that means unroll a kimono, and it means that it's the process of making something become fulfilled. And so this is about rolling out or deploying an agreed upon plan of action. So what is there in that? So there's a slogan. It says, this is what we're going to do. When I was at Xerox, Canon had a slogan, kill Xerox, very clear. And then the issue, what do we need to do? So we need to improve the productive costs of the system. The end, what is the final state? The means, the way we're going to apply that. The target, what needs to be done, and the milestones to create it. The schedule or the timeline along which it will be done, and then the responsible act. So the Japanese word for policy in the West is actually what we mean by a strategic plan. And if we move an organization towards its division, we have to figure out how do we manage cross-functional processes? How do we create linked and aligned measurement systems and a sound metric system? How do we develop this evidence-based approach to work? How do we understand systems integration effects of the work processes? And how do we stimulate employees' desire to work and engage them and establish a strategic pathway based on sound measurements? So changes must improve results delivered to the daily management system. So as we come to the close of our session, seems like it's just gone by so fast, but we have time for questions and answers. There are a couple of takeaway lessons, and I'd like to leave this from the perspective of Mary Parker Follett. So Mary Parker Follett in 1925 made the observation, the word profession connotates a foundation of science and a motive of service. I think this is what needs to become more and more true of how we operate in quality. We have to be more scientifically based, and we have to have a motive of service, how we work together. And she also made the comment, professionals work to advance their knowledge domain, where there is no one else in the world but yourselves to create the science, the art, the profession of management. So what will be our contribution? How will we develop our competence to a mastery level? How will you contribute to advancement of the quality profession? So some critical takeaway observations. So what can we do as quality professionals to increase company-wide performance results by applying strategic quality? Well, strategic quality enables executive inquiry to discover its needs for change. It facilitates a search for opportunities to improve, and it formulates a portfolio of projects that will deliver desired change into the daily management system of the organization. So this webinar has actually addressed 3 learning objectives. Hopefully, you'll understand a little bit more about how we can apply quality in the pursuit of strategy. We've discovered how the strategic quality pursuit actually operates, and learn how the executive function drives this intent to improve. So at this point in time, I'd like to thank you very much for having borne with me. We have, I think, about 13 minutes now, and we can take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. We have some questions. People have been, posting them various places, and I've got probably too many for us to go over. I want you to remind all of you that if we don't get to your question, that's okay. You may send an email to Dr. Watson. His email is on the screen. You may jot that down. It's simple and easy to remember. All right, so Chuck asked the question earlier. He says, can you expand on the challenges of achieving a consistent approach to continual improvement?
Well, there's a lot of, that's not a small question, it's a big question, Chuck. Well, the challenge of achieving continual improvement, that's what happens actually in the daily management system. So the difference between continuous and continual, if you want to see that, take a look at my LinkedIn. I've got a document that goes into that in 10 pages, and I'll probably be publishing more on that as the summer goes on. But the idea of continual improvement is that we go through this process and we have an opportunity to reflect on what we're going to do. The problem with most organizations is we spend so much time doing and acting that we don't really have sufficient time for planning and checking. In the Toyota management system, 80% of the time is spent doing. That's the productive work of the organization. And the other 20% of the time is spent on the standardizing and the checking and the acting. So that's the adjustment of the system. So I think that the most important thing is that check step. Do we really take time to reflect on what needs to be done? And I think that we need to develop some methodologies for doing that. How do we have reflective sessions where people can actually have the time to think? If we don't have the time to think, we won't have the opportunity to improve. Another question.
Yes. Can you briefly tell them what your LinkedIn address is?
Yeah, it's if you go to LinkedIn, you'll just check my name, or just put Gregory H. Watson LinkedIn, and you'll get me.
Ah, good. Okay.
Just put it in your browser window.
Okay. James asks a question. Sensemaking seems like it's risk management. Do I understand that correctly?
Sensemaking is more than just risk management. Risk management is a part of that. I'm not planning a lecture on risk management in this series, but I do have a process for risk management, which I've developed over 20 years now. But in risk management, you're trying to understand how do we mitigate risks. So in sense-making, in a strategic sense, you're trying to understand what are the dominant risks facing an organization, and then what do we have to do about them. So if you look at risk management tools that have been traditionally used, I don't really like them, but FMEA, for instance, the purpose behind that is to get you to make a choice. What's the likelihood we will see this risk come to fruition? And then how severe will the effect of that risk be? On whom will that risk actually impact? How big will the impact be in terms of cost, business issues, and a whole bunch of other things? So sense-making is coupled very tightly with risk management. But it's also part of, if you will, structured problem solving. So how do we actually address the problem? So making sense out of a problem. It's also the whole front end on the risk issue analysis. So it's basically situational awareness and sense making were developed as concepts in social psychology by Carl Wick, and he has a number of books on them. And I think that this is a developing area where the quality community needs to learn more about what the psychology community has been doing for the last 35 years.
Okay, thanks. So there were, a couple of questions that I answered during the talk, questions about, root cause analysis and 5 whys. I believe I answered them in the chat window. Tim has a question, though. He says, what feedback loops exist between the 3 Gembas? Does Gemba 2 inform the success of Gemba 3?
Well, this is actually how we build most management systems. Organizational hierarchies that we see in organization charts are really pathways of communication in organizations, or formal pathways of communication. I think it's interesting, Peter Drucker and several other management consultants who I admire have said that it's not the formal organization that allows change to happen, it's the informal organization, the networks between people who make the actions happen. So as we're taking a look at these 3 different Gemba, what we start seeing is there is a dialogue that is, in Japanese the word is nemawashi, it means a negotiation process. It's sometimes translated as catchwall, where we start seeing that there is a bouncing back and forth, and it's a give and take in the organization. The root word for nemawashi is actually the sharpening of the sword, where we have a outcome we'd like to have that's a steel blade, We have a measurement system that's a template that the blade should be cut to. And then we have the organization as the grindstone and the oil that we're using to take this very small pieces out of that hard blade to make it do what we'd like to do at the end, the productive cut of that of that sword. So there's lots of communication processes that have to happen. And I think in many organizations, the biggest failing is not having open communication channels. Those communication channels have to be filled with trust. They have to be honest. The data has to have integrity. In other words, it says what it means. And all of that is important in terms of making those ingredients of strategic processes happen. At Nokia, we created that phrase strategic dialogue, and that meant to create this communication process in the organization so that it can flow. And we'll see more of this happening in the next lecture, which is going to be on the Japanese system. We'll see how those communication vehicles actually work.
Okay, and this one, I think you answered it already. Luis asked the question, how do you get people from different organization levels involved in the strategic planning process? That sounds like it comes off of what you just said.
It does, and I think that you have to realize that when you're setting the strategy, that at the top level, they don't know what the detailed change in the organization has to be. They can figure out some broad direction they'd like to have. That's what we call strategic intent. And they have to have a dialogue with the middle of the organization to figure out how do you sharpen the sword. And then that allows them to sharpen their strategic intent, which then drives the governance function, which is the purpose of the organization, which is laid out in the legal charter that grants the organization's right to conduct business. And then as that comes down, we change strategic intent and it becomes a project. But the whole thing that we're changing is the value engine of the organization, which is the daily management system. And we take a look in the way the Japanese present this, we'll see that this daily management system, the routine work, that's where change has to be efficient. That's where we have to make this process flow in a way that delivers the productive outcomes that we're looking. And I'm going to talk more about this next week when we have the ASQ conference. I've got an hour there. Also, we'll be talking about digitizing quality and in terms of the age of quality, the age of complexity, and how we're going to manage this in what we're calling Quality 4.0.
Okay, great. The couple people have asked if the slides are available for download, and I believe I've been telling them to just email you, Dr. Watson. Is that?
Yeah, I'll put the slides up also on my website, on my LinkedIn. So if you take a look, I will have the links that are the QMD links and also the links to the papers, the PowerPoint, the PDF of the papers slides.
Okay, so yeah, that'll help people get the material they're interested in. So we're, guess we're more or less running out of time here. I do appreciate that. I guess there's one more question from Victor we can answer. He says, so should there be a position for a sense management analysis, one dedicated to the task of forward strategic planning and analysis to benefit the strategic quality function?
Yes, I call that the Chief Quality Officer. That's what I believe the role of the Chief Quality Officer will be, the trusted advisor and guide and facilitator of the strategic planning process for the CEO of a large organization. And I think that is a very legitimate role for the quality function to have. We're interested in improvement, and you know, I talk to executives. You know, they try to say that quality is not, you know, on my agenda, and I ask them, you know, aren't you concerned about the quality of the finances, you know, and the revenue streams, and you know, how you do in markets and how you address shareholders and stock analysts? And they say yes, and that's quality. So the question is, you know, that to get that type of quality output, we have to have quality in the daily management system that delivers it without having any losses or frictions or lags, time lags in the system, so that the operational system creates a financial loss, if you will. And so that means all of the things that we talk about, whether we're talking about quality or lean production, we have to be able to translate that into a business environment to make sure we're delivering the quality outcome that's necessary for all three levels of the organization.
Okay, sort of that classic argument between product quality and process quality, which we could go on all night on that one.
Well, actually, there is no argument. Both are necessary and they must be done together. And I think that's going to be the big lesson. And I do cover that actually in the May 6th presentation I'll be giving.
Okay then, great. Well, thank you very much. We're going to